In this lecture, we're going to be looking at approaches we can use to ethical thinking in design. We're going to be particularly concentrating on understanding the context. This is an important issue for ethics, but it's also an important and useful approach for designers. So let's have a look at some of the approaches that we can take to dealing with ethical questions during a design process, but also in the real world. How do we approach ethical thinking? Well, it seems to me that when faced with an ethical question, we tend to take one of two main approaches. The first approach I've called intuition. This is an intuitive approach where we don't really do any analysis. We rely on either our gut feel. So we have a gut feel when we're faced with an ethical question. This is probably the immediate thing that comes to us when what we think we should do. So what action should we take in this ethical situation? We have an immediate gut reaction. However, a slightly more sophisticated view, and certainly when things are in conflict, are what we might call heuristics, or vuistregels in Dutch. Heuristics come from our moral system. Essentially, within our moral system, we're usually led to understand that certain acts are worse than others, and certain things are better than others. So when faced with a conflict, we might apply one of these heuristics. An example would be if I was being chased by an axe murderer and you hid me, and then the axe murderer came to your door and asked the question, "Is Charlie there?" You would normally not consider the idea that lying about this was unethical. In fact, the unethical thing would be, based on this heuristic, would be that actually it would be wrong to tell the truth, because you'd be causing my death maybe. So the heuristic here is that in situations like this, saving someone's life is better than lying. So it's probably okay sometimes to save someone's life. That's how we generally solve ethical questions in our daily life. We either use gut feel or heuristics. However, there is another approach, and this is more an analysis approach. This is the approach I'd recommend for designers. Because, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the issue that you have to face is dealing with autonomy. A lot of the ethical questions that you'll come up with will be how you affect the autonomy of your user and other people. And as I mentioned before, this is an important issue. So what are the two approaches you can take here? Well, the first approach is what might be called using codes of ethics. Lots of businesses, lots of professions have codes of ethics. These are actually, if you want, ways of coding what you should do as a professional or as a person who's working for a company. They're like heuristics, but they're much more explicit. They're actually written down. The second approach to analysis is to use philosophy, and obviously that's the one I'm going to be recommending, although all of them are actually interesting and useful, and we'll come back to those later. So, how can we go forward? Well, let's look at intuition. A big question is intuition enough? The thing about intuition is it's a sort of gut feeling as well. It's a gut feeling in the sense that it's something that feels right. Even the heuristics we use feel right to us. And that's mostly brought about by our background, by the moral system we've been brought up into, by our education, by our culture, and these sorts of things. Essentially, this is the basis of our worldview. So our intuitions are partly about our realities, and those realities might not apply to other people. And this is an important question, because do we really have a right to impose our intuitions on other people who might not agree with our intuitions? The two examples below are examples of where designers, architects in this case, came up with a vision of how the world should be. And that vision, they preferenced their own views about how the world should be, or the views of other people how the world should be, above perhaps the people who actually have to live in the accommodation that they were proposing. So on the left is an example from a Swiss architect called Le Corbusier, and this is his plan for how Paris should look. His idea was to completely gut the whole of the central part of Paris and replace it with this sort of building. This is based on his vision that buildings and cities are machines for living in, and he felt that we would live more comfortably and more happily in an environment like this because essentially what we were looking for were machines to live in. There are many people who disagree with that, and the question is it acceptable to impose this on other people? Fortunately, in this case, this plan never came to fruition. However, on the right, there's an example of a motorway that goes right through the middle of Newcastle in the UK. And you'll notice that there's a house that's or a number of houses that are almost attached to the motorway. These houses were actually part of a row of houses, and what this was the houses in the middle and on the other side of the motorway were actually demolished. What this did was it destroyed a very large community. It meant that people who lived very close to their family no longer could. The family members maybe lived 2 or 3 doors up, but now because of this motorway they decided they had to be moved outside the city. The question here is the architect here obviously, or the city planners here in fact, obviously planned this and based it on the idea that perhaps it's more important for people to be able to get to places more quickly than it is for people to live in good communities. Again, is this defensible? So it's quite important to ask, is it actually acceptable to impose our intuitions on other people, or should we base this on some sort of analysis? I believe this is really important because essentially we're doing ethics for other people. We're affecting the behaviour of other people as designers, and as a result we should take this very seriously. Another question, of course, is who should we trust anyway? Should we trust our own intuition? Should we trust our client's intuition? Should we trust society's intuition, the government's intuition? It's very hard to tell. So when we're facing really very deep and problematic ethical issues, the question is, should we trust our intuition? Or is it not good enough? That's the big question.